Good morning. It is such a joy to be with you. 26 years ago, I met this guy, and then we got married, and then 3 years later, we had our firstborn, Cade, many of you know, with a Down syndrome diagnosis. And within a few years, we moved to New York City, and we had 2 more children right after Cade, Pierce 2 years later, and Kennedy 2 years after that. And it came to my attention that we never really gave Cade the label Down syndrome to our children. He was Cade. Cade was Cade. Cade learned a little differently, took a little longer. He just grew up in our community, and all our kids' friends were noticing they had some questions about Cade. Well, we moved to New York in 2010. Cade is 9 at this time. And so there's new kids encountering Cade, and they're trying to understand what's going on with him. And I remember one day Pierce coming home and saying, "Mom, what's Down syndrome?" Some kids were making fun of Cade on the playground today. They called him dumb, they called him retarded, and a little tear, forms in the corner of Pierce's eye, and he wants to understand what is the thing that's going on right now? Why are people being unkind to my big brother Cade? And so I pulled him in, and I remembered a prayer of a friend right when we had Cade, right after he was born, before our other kids came along, and this friend had prayed that when we would get to explain Cade's diagnosis to our other kids, that God would grace them with just a love for Cade, and that we wouldn't start with a label. Here's the thing, when you know someone, you no longer label them. And what I learned with being Cade's mom from 26 on, so now we're 21 years into being his mom, is that when I explained this to his brother and sister, I said, hey, you know what? The label Down syndrome is just to help the world understand what Cade has come up again. It doesn't define Cade. It isn't who he is. It doesn't make up his personality. He still writes with his left hand like his mom. He's a goofball like his dad. Yes, Gabe is crazy. I know you don't see that right now, but at home, there's another side of Gabe that comes out. And so they wanted to know him as him. And what this taught me is just this understanding is that when we label someone, we negate them. And so this has gone on and on and on in different ways. I'm so glad to know that there's advocacy around special needs, and this is not something that is so alienating and isolating. But I look at 2020, 21, 22, and the polarization that's come when we continue to label one another, when we continue to put us versus them. So I just want to read a moment what Romans is commanding us right here. Let love be without hypocrisy. Detest evil and cling to what is good. Love one another deeply as brothers and sisters. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lack diligence and zeal. Be fervent in the spirit. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in affliction. Be persistent in prayer. Share with the saints in their needs and pursue hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless those who do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud. Instead, associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Give careful thought to do what is honorable in everyone's eyes. And if possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. A couple years after this conversation with the kids about Cade and how people saw him as the other, I went to Israel on a peacemaking trip with about 30 writers, and we had conversations with Israeli and Palestinian mamas who had lost their sons to one another through war. One side in war killed the other side. One side in war killed the other side. And these women had committed to gather, to love, to live at peace, right? It was so contrary to what we were even imagining. And what we did one day, midweek, is we decided to make jam. We came together, about 30 of us, and we watched these women, these mamas, these survivors who could have hated one another, who could have decided for the rest of their lives they would not encounter one another, would not be friends with one another, but they decided to break bread and make jam. So we had this jam making day. And I remember thinking, you know what? We talk so much about peace, peace, peace. But what I was so gripped by, even in the Holy Land, is that you can't know peace apart from the Prince of Peace. And sometimes when there's conflict, when there's labeling, when there's us versus them, we get back into our own ability to create peace. And Jesus is so clear. He says, the peace I give, the world cannot give. So don't be troubled and afraid. And so what does it look like to stay in relationship with someone that you don't really agree with. You don't see things the same way. You don't land in the same place. You're hearing a lot of conversations today and tomorrow about opposites, right? The polarization of ideas and how there's a war on ideas. But how do we, as Christ followers, and how are we ones who are peacemakers, who are children of God? It says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they are children of God. And then when we hold this tension, I'm reminded of 1 John, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I wonder, how do we be faithful? How do we be a faithful remnant who can hold a tension of something that's challenging and gripping, and that we can still discern in the armor of God with the belt of truth, that we can understand that there's a difference between the truth and a lie, right? So we can wear a belt of truth, but also we can have feet that are shod with the preparation of a gospel of peace, right? So we can hold the tension of knowing truth, but we can be ones who carry peace. That when we enter a room, we are carriers of peace. We usher in peace. I'm coming here to this idea of how do we know God through love? If we're supposed to live at peace through love, then when we jump here, it says, one who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, because God is love. Well, we could start there. So maybe we could people who love, who carry peace, because we know God, because God is love. And we don't need to expect people outside the church to act the same way, because perhaps they don't know God. But if we do, and we claim to be born of God and know God, the one who does not love does not know God, because God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his son into the world so that we might live through him. Love consists in this. Not that we love God, but he loved us first and sent his son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sin. So if God loves us in this way, we must love one another. We also must. It's a must. It's not an optional. It's not a maybe. It's not if they agree with you. It's not if they don't call you names. It's not if their son did or did not kill your son. We must show love. Dear friends, this is how we know that we remain in him and he in us. He has given us his spirit. So when the spirit comes as a counselor who brings us peace, we now can remain in him, and we see and testify that the Father sent his son. And we have come to know and believe the love that God has for us. So what? What do we do with this? God is love, and the one who remains in love remains in God, and God remains in him. This is the point. This is the point, that we remain. Not only do we remain in God, we remain with one another. We remain in relationship. We decide to not leave the room when we hear something we don't like, when we hear something we don't agree with. We decide not to break covenant or break relationship as brothers and sisters. It's in the church and it's outside the church. How do we remain? How do we remain in love? Here's the thing right here. There is no fear in love. Instead, perfect love drives out fear, because fear involves punishment. So the one who fears is not complete in love. The one who fears is not complete in love. Do we need to be that person? Do we need to be, as sons and daughters of God, again, peacemakers who are children of God, do we need to be the ones who fear that involves punishment? We love because he first loved us. And this is how we know we are God's children, when we love God and obey his commands. And these commands are not a burden. We remain. If the seedbed of revival is prayer, I also believe that the seedbed of revival is when we remain. That we set a tone as a church, as the people, the sons and daughters of God, decide we are going to stay. We're going to stay in relationship with one another. We're reconciled to the Father, reconciled to each other, so that the world outside could see that we did not leave the room when things got